There is a question that sits underneath all of economics. Underneath every market, every price, every currency, every war ever fought over land or oil or gold. Underneath your salary, your rent, the number on your bank screen. One question that, if you look at it honestly, begins to dissolve everything you thought you understood about how the world works. Why does anything have value? Not how is value measured, not what makes prices go up or down. The question is more fundamental than that. Why does anything matter enough for one human being to give something to another human being in exchange for it? This is where economics actually begins. Not with Adam Smith, not with markets, not with money. It begins here in this question, which most people never ask because they are too busy participating in the system to ever stop and look at what the system is sitting on. So let's look. Pick up anything near you, a phone, a glass of water, a shoe. Now ask, why does this have value? The first answer that comes is obvious. Because I need it. Because it does something for me. Because without it something is worse. That answer is pointing at something real. Value seems to begin with need, with the body wanting to survive. Water has value because without it the body stops. Food has value because without it the body stops. Shelter has value because without it the body, in most climates, stops. So at the very bottom, value is biological. It is the organism trying to continue. And for most of human history, that was essentially the whole story. You grew food because you needed to eat. You built shelter because you needed to not freeze. You stayed near the fire because fire kept predators away. There was no abstraction. Value was immediate. Value was survival. Value was the present moment pressing on the body. Then something happened. Something that changed everything and that we have still not fully understood. Humans began to produce more than they needed. Not much more at first. A good hunt, a surplus of grain after a good season. But enough. Enough that someone had something another person wanted, and that person had something the first person wanted. And instead of taking it by force, which was always an option, they exchanged. One thing for another. This is called barter, and it sounds simple, but what it represents is extraordinary. It means value became relational. It was no longer just about what something does for you in isolation. It became about what something does for you in relation to what someone else has and wants. Value jumped from being a property of things to being a property of the space between people. This is the first great movement, and almost no one notices it. When value becomes relational, it becomes unstable. Because what I want and what you want are not fixed. They shift. They depend on context, on timing, on circumstance. A farmer with 10 bags of grain wants shoes. A cobbler with 10 pairs of shoes wants grain. Fine. But what if the cobbler doesn't need grain right now? What if he already has enough? The exchange breaks. The value was there. Objectively, the grain could feed him. Objectively, the shoes could warm the farmer's feet. But the exchange doesn't happen because desire is not synchronized. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants. Both people need to want what the other has at the same moment. And in a village of 20 people, this is manageable. In a society of millions, it is impossible. So humans invented something. Something so clever and so strange that we have been living inside it for thousands of years without really seeing what it is. They invented a thing that stood for value, a placeholder. A token that said, I have done something, produced something, given something, and this token is the evidence of that. Give me this token and I will give you what I have. And you can take that token to anyone else who has agreed to accept it, and they will give you what they have. This is money. Not coins. Not paper. Not numbers on a screen. Money is an agreement. Money is a collective fiction that functions as fact because everyone participates in it. Read that again, because this is important. Money is not a thing. Money is a story that humans tell each other, and because everyone believes the story becomes real. The moment the story stops being believed, the moment people lose faith in the currency, the money stops working. Not slowly. Immediately. You have seen this in history. Hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Argentina repeating the same collapse every decade. The paper didn't change. The ink didn't change. What changed was belief. And when belief went, value went with it. So now we are at something interesting. Something that should stop you. If value at its origin is biological, rooted in real need, in the body's requirement to survive and money as an abstraction, a story layered on top of that, then at what point does the abstraction lose contact with the reality underneath it? At what point does the story start being told not about real things people need, but about the story itself? This is not a philosophical question, this is what financial markets actually are. When a company's stock price rises because people believe it will rise, not because the company has created more real value for real people, that is, the story feeding on itself. When housing prices double in a city, not because twice as many people need shelter, but because investors are buying and selling the expectation of future price, that is, the abstraction untethered from the ground. When a cryptocurrency with no underlying utility reaches $1 trillion in total value, because enough people agreed that it would, that is, money doing what money was always capable of doing, which is floating away from what it was supposed to represent. And here is what becomes clear when you see this. The history of economics is not primarily the history of how humans organize the production and distribution of real things. It is the history of how humans manage the gap between real value and abstract value, and how, repeatedly, they lost track of where real value ended and the story began. Most economic crises are not crises of production. The factories still stand, the workers still exist, the food is still growing. The crisis is a crisis of the story. The story breaks, confidence collapses, and suddenly real things, real houses, real companies, real labor cannot find each other, because the medium of exchange, the agreed fiction, has fractured. This is not a flaw in the design, this is the design. Because the only alternative to abstract value is pure barter, and pure barter cannot run a civilization of 8 billion people. The abstraction was necessary. The story had to be told. But telling a story means you are always one broken belief away from the whole structure shaking. And the people who understand this, who understand that value is ultimately a story, and that whoever controls the story controls the value, these are the people who have held power in every society that has ever used money. The priests who declared certain metals sacred, the kings who minted coins with their faces on them, the banks that were allowed to create money by making loans, the central banks today that set interest rates, which is another way of saying they set the price of the story itself. You were born into this. You did not choose it. Nobody handed you a document explaining that the numbers in your account are entries in a shared ledger that only work because everyone agrees they work. Nobody told you that the salary you work 40 hours a week for is not payment for your time, but payment in the form of tokens in a story that could, in principle, become worthless. You learned the prices of things before you learned what price actually is. And so the question returns, clearer now. Why does anything have value? The honest answer is because something real needs it, or because enough people agree it does. And those two things are not always the same. The first is rooted, the second is floating. And most of what we call the economy is the relationship between those two, the real needs of bodies living in a physical world, and the abstract stories humans have built to try to meet those needs at scale. Economics begins to make sense when you hold both. When you see the real, the grain, the labor, the land, the energy, the time of a human life, and you also see the story, the price, the wage, the interest rate, the valuation, the currency. Neither is more important to ignore. The person who only sees the real becomes naive about how power actually moves. The person who only sees the story loses contact with what the whole machinery is supposed to be for. The whole machinery is supposed to be for the living, for real bodies, in real places, with real needs, trying to live something that means something. That is where we start. The ground. Everything else we will look at grows from here.